Thank you for tuning in to our Scholar Spotlight. My name is Brad Fulton, and I serve as the director of the Faith and Prejudice Institute, which is part of the larger Faith and Prejudice movement. Our mission is to convene, equip, and mobilize churches to build bridges to racial equity. And at the Institute, we focus on curating and disseminating research on race and religion. Our aim is to cultivate an informed and inspired public on this topic. And as part of our Scholar Spotlight series, today we're interviewing Professor Khari Brown. Dr. Brown earned his PhD in sociology and social work from the University of Michigan, and he's been a professor at Wayne State University his entire career. Professor Brown is also currently serving as the president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. Dr. Brown is an expert on race, religion, and politics, and he recently published a book entitled Race and the Power of Sermons on American Politics. And it's the content of this book that we'll be focusing our conversation on today. Thank you, Professor Brown, for joining us, and let's jump right in.
Great.
Race, religion, and politics are some of the most polarizing topics in the U.S. Can you share a little bit about your biography and how you ended up becoming a professor who studies these topics?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for inviting me to the show. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where I am right now. And so Ann Arbor is a upper middle class, racially integrated city. It's the location of the University of Michigan, so it's also a very progressive city as well. And growing up in Ann Arbor, I attended Bethel AME Church, which is an African Methodist Episcopal church on the north side of Ann Arbor, which is essentially located on the northern end of the University of Michigan's campus. And first of all, I'm 46. So when I was growing up here in Ann Arbor and attending church at Bethel, most of the adults at that church were like my parents. They were migrants from the north, from the south. And for most of them, they were first generation middle class. I mean, this really for them was, in all of American history, was the first generation of middle class African Americans that really benefited from the opportunity structure in this country. And so at their church, we had most of the church, probably over half the church were first generation college graduates, first generation professionals, and they came of age during the Civil Rights and Black Power movement. And so at that church, we learned a lot about African American history. It was a heavily, I would say, in terms of what we learned at the church, it was heavily infused Christianity with African American history and African American struggle. There are lots of parallels all the time during Sunday school, during church services, during special programs that align the experiences of, for example, the Hebrew slaves in the Old Testament, escaping slavery with the African American experience. So that was something that we learned quite a bit at the church. The NAACP met there. We had tutoring programs that tutored African American kids in the city. Every election cycle, local elected officials as well as individuals running for Congress would show up to the church and ask us for a vote. So it was, looking back, it was a very political church, but it didn't seem political because it really neatly aligned biblical learning with what was happening in Ann Arbor, around the country, as well as internationally. I mean, we had events where we discussed apartheid, racial apartheid in South Africa. So that's where I came of age. And going to college, I wanted to learn more about race. Going to college at Wayne State University, and when I got to the University of Michigan for graduate school, I wanted to look at what's the connection between religion and racial justice specifically. And this was largely informed by what I learned at Bethel and the fact, again, that my dad, and mentioned this, he's a political scientist, and he taught Sunday school. And so a lot of the stuff we learned in church, he was teaching. So that made me, it wasn't a stretch for me when I got to college. It wasn't a stretch for me when I got to graduate school to want to be more interested in race, to really understand is what I experienced at Bethel AME Church, is that unique, or is that something fairly common among African Americans more generally?
Sure.
And those experiences really carried me on from graduate school to what I wanted to do when I landed at Wayne State University.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's a great question. Like your background and your experience sort of prepared you perfectly for this field of study. And your question was, is your experience at Bethel AME
Right.
is that unique or not? And
Right.
what have you found? Is it
Right.
unique
Right.
or is it it's commonplace?
Well, I mean, if you look at the survey data, what you find is fairly consistently over the past, I would say, 40 years, that between 4 and 10 African Americans say they hear at least one sermon about politics broadly defined
Hmm.
in their place of worship. When you talk specifically about race, it goes between 40 and 50%.
Hmm.
So on average, I would say but between 40 and 50% of African Americans say in surveys that they hear these types of sermons at least once during the course of the year.
Hmm.
So in that respect, I would say it's not too uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
I would say what is uncommon is in terms of the depth that we went into in studying these topics, because we had a high concentration of African American professionals at the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that part right there was uncommon. So you had professors, my dad was a professor at Wayne State, you had professors from the University of Michigan, you had lawyers, you had people in corporate America. That part's unique. And that I think that part led to probably more in-depth discussion and meetings about these issues probably than occurred in other African American churches with their socioeconomic status is considerably lower than Bethlehem Church in Ann Arbor.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right.
Well, so when I was reading your book, I think one of the things that captured my attention was you talk about the Exodus narrative. And can you explain a little bit about what that is and how it relates to the broader focus of your book?
One of the points we make in the book is that we really are interested in this idea of civil religion, and there are different types of civil religion. This basic idea that individuals understand their experiences with a religious frame. So part of the African American religious frame is this Exodus narrative, escaping slavery and making it to Canaan land. So for African Americans, it's the North, and then after 1850, it's Canada. But even when you look at the post-slavery era, I mean, you have great migrations that are occurring. First in the 1910s with World War I, and then World War II, you have another great migration, which my mom was a part of after her family left in early 1950. And it is this narrative of seeking out areas of greater freedom and greater opportunity. And that's a common trope that you hear among African American clergy when they talk about the importance of voting, or talk about the importance of engaging in different forms of movements, aligning our struggle with that of the Hebrew slaves in the Old Testament. Part of what it does is it connects for me, listening to these types of sermons growing up and even now, it makes you feel like, oh, even though we are part of a group that has been oppressed, God still loves us, as God loves the Hebrew slaves in the Old Testament. So that's a common trope. That's a common means by which adroit African American clergy attempt to connect contemporary struggles with experiences of characters in Old and New Testament.
So yeah, I mean, it seems like with your research, you did a specific focus on sermons. And how is the racial composition of a congregation related to how social justice or racial justice is discussed in sermons? So does the racial composition affect how the sermons are, or how these topics are discussed?
No, in our survey, we were not able to look at how the racial composition of places of worship impact what people hear. So the degree to which a congregation is majority African American or majority white, or if it's more racially balanced. As a survey research, and we relied upon surveys where we ask individuals in past 12 months, what have you heard in your place of worship? So in that respect, we looked at what African Americans said that they heard, what whites said they heard, what Hispanics said that they heard. And what we found is that among African American individuals, they were considerably more likely, in survey after survey after survey, to say that they heard sermons about politics broadly defined, as well as about race, poverty, and war and peace issues, which makes sense given the socioeconomic position that African Americans occupy in this country. With that does explain a lot in terms of why they're more likely to hear sermons about race and
mm,
poverty. Um, and I think the war aspect as well is, as a group that has historically been oppressed, and still, if you look at inequality of life indicators,
mm,
African Americans are on the bottom, nearly all of them. COVID, I think, well exemplifies this point in terms of how African Americans are much more likely to contract it and succumb from it.
mm,
That internationally, African Americans identify with groups that are oppressed, marginalized. So it does make sense that we would be more likely also to hear sermons about, in this case, the United States military policy against Middle Eastern countries.
mm,
Um, Hispanics are more likely to hear sermons about immigration and refugees, which again makes sense given their experience in this country.
mhm, mhm,
So that's what you see, and this is not
mm.
unique to like one specific survey. When you look at
Sure.
many different surveys taken at different points in time, you basically see the same pattern
Mm.
in terms of what people say they're hearing in their place of worship.
So in a sense, your experience at Bethel AME was consistent across other predominantly Black churches. But then if you went to Latino churches or predominantly white churches, it would be a different experience. It's kind of what you're discovering.
Correct. Correct. Correct.
And so I guess for me, like a big question or a
Right.
broad question that's out there is,
Right.
should churches engage in political activity and why?
Well, I'll answer the question in two ways.
Hmm.
One is, what do people think? What do the average person thinks that churches should do?
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at that, you do get about, when you ask if congregations should focus on, if you ask if congregations to talk about political issues, it's about 40% that say
Mm-hmm.
yes, they should. If you ask
Mm-hmm.
specifically about should they talk about race, it
Mm-hmm.
goes up to about, depending if it's African Americans, whites, or Hispanics, African Americans, close to 70% of African Americans say yes, they should talk about race. Um, Among white Americans, it's over half. Among Hispanics, it's over half as well. When you ask if they should talk about environmental issues, again, it's over half. Immigration is over half. So when you talk about specific issues, a lot higher proportion of the population say yes, they should talk about these issues than if you say politics, broadly defined.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to me, when I look at that, what I'm sensing from it, just through the survey research, is that many people, particularly people that are connected to religious congregations, say that their congregations should speak to moral or ethical issues of the day. They should
Mm-hmm.
talk about that. Um, Now, in terms of legally, should they talk about it? Um, According to the IRS tax code, they can't engage in partisan politics. They can't encourage individuals to vote for one candidate or against another. And in some cases, clergy have walked that line quite a bit. I mean, many times they often do walk that line quite a bit, because you don't have to say. I mean, I can give a concrete example. 2003, Reverend George Regas, who was a pastor at All Saints Pasadena Church, All Saints Episcopal Church in Pasadena, he preached a sermon condemning the Iraq War.
Mm-hmm.
And shortly after he preached the sermon, the IRS was investigating All Saints Pasadena Church for engaging in partisan politics. Of course, his argument was that he wasn't engaging in partisan politics, although it was very clear what position he took when he made the case that as Christians, we should not support a war for oil, and we should not support candidates that are encouraging the military to pursue a war for profit. Now that's very clear in 2003. It's an election between Bush and Kerry, who he's talking about, although he never mentioned the candidates. So he walked that fine line. He was initially investigated, but eventually the IRS dropped the case. So should they, from a legal standpoint, no, they shouldn't, but it's very rare for the federal government to actually prosecute a clergy member or an individual in a place of worship for talking politics.
Sure.
Because it can go both ways.
In
In one election, you have someone that is arguing that we should not go support this war that's being pushed by a Republican president. Another election, you may have religious person saying that, for example, the Supreme Court ruling was correct. The abortion, the Supreme Court ruling to overturn Roe versus Wade, that was correct. And as Republican strategists, you may not want to prosecute or go after this
Sure.
individual.
Yeah.
So uh, because clergy are often, depending upon their ideological framework, are taking different positions on the same issues, it's rare
Yeah.
that the federal government will go after a clergy because in some cases it may benefit a political party, in other cases it may not.
Sure.
So legally, should they? It really depends. In
Yeah.
terms of
Well, and
yeah,
I
yeah,
really like
right,
the way you frame it because,
right.
in a sense, what would happen to a congregation if they engaged in political activity that wasn't allowed by the IRS is they actually would just lose their nonprofit status. I don't. It's not illegal. Like a person wouldn't get prosecuted.
No,
Um,
exactly. They would lose their
but
tax
what?
exempt status. That's what would happen. Exactly
Yeah.
correct. Right.
Um, and but what I think is fascinating about what you bring up is congregations should address the issues that affect their members. And so, whether it be immigration or racial inequality or health inequities, um, so they address those issues, and those issues are inherently political, in the sense with a small p, in that they're related to public policy. We live in a democratic society, and so I need to vote on this policy or not. And sometimes the general public, when they think about political activity, they say, "Oh, are you going to endorse this candidate or not?" And really, when I'm thinking about political activity of congregations, it's engaging in the political process of understanding policies, the
Right.
cost and
Right.
benefits, the trade-offs.
Exactly.
And so, if we think of a congregation that wants to engage in political activity, what instead of just endorsing a candidate, what are the, I guess, other tangible ways that a congregation could actually engage in political activity that doesn't violate IRS rules?
Well, okay. I'm gonna answer this question in two ways. One, it's
Yeah.
very rare that the IRS are going to actually go after and prosecute a congregation for violating the tax code, which would lead them to lose their tax exempt. Actually, I don't think that's ever happened.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, because again, it really depends upon who's in office at the time. Because
Hmm.
like I said, under Republican administration, they would be more comfortable with religious leaders, clergy, taking positions that are consistent with their policy platform. And then, of course, when Democrats in office, they will want that same support as well. So again, it's very rare that they would do that because even though religious attendance has been declining over the past 40 years, you still have, millions of Americans that are attending places of worship, and that still is a very cost-efficient way to recruit voters and financial support as well. So
Sure.
it's just not in the interest of both major political parties to prosecute to come down too hard on uh, religious leaders for talking about issues. And
Hmm.
then the other point, I don't want to get off tangent, but when you, in surveys, very few, like maybe 15 to 20% of respondents say that their clergy encourage them to vote for a specific candidate.
Hmm.
Very
Hmm.
few say that.
Hmm.
So they'll say like maybe 30 to 40%, 30 to 35% will say that they heard political issues.
Hmm.
And then you ask more specifically, that percentage goes up.
Sure.
So the idea that they're actually endorsing candidates and encouraging individuals to support to donate money to candidates, that's very few, relatively few people admit that that is happening within their place of worship. Um, so that's one thing.
Yeah.
Uh, Second thing, I'd like to just to back up just a little bit in terms of what we mean when we say politics, and I can just give you just an example from the congregation that I attend,
Hmm.
and that I also see in qualitative research and survey research. Typically, what I see in my readings and just kind of anecdotal evidence is that religious people that are attending congregations, they are, if they're involved in community work, they're involved in issues that the members are dealing with. So for example,
Hmm.
if in some congregations, and for example in Southwest Detroit, they attract a large immigrant population. So providing services for immigrants and refugees, that is, an issue that's affecting people that are attending the place of worship and their family members and people that may live around that congregation. So that would be an
Hmm.
issue that is not simply a community issue, but it's an issue for people that are attending the congregation itself.
Hmm.
And then some congregations take the leap from addressing, day-to-day issues to defining these issues as broader policy issues. So we
Mm-hmm.
have an issue of, migrants, have difficulty finding jobs, or they have
Mm-hmm.
difficulty learning English, or they have difficulty finding schools that provide English language courses, and that
Mm-hmm.
may lead them to have conversations with nonprofit organizations or local elected officials that lead to policy discussions. So initially, for many congregations, it's not, movement politics. It's addressing issues that their congregants are directly facing. So within African American congregations, it could be poverty, issues of police brutality, issues of the quality of schools that lead to further policy discussion to deal with not just this one case, but the case that many families in the congregation and outside the congregations are dealing with. So for many, if you ask, are they dealing with political issues, they may not say, no, these aren't political issues. These are just issues that people in the congregation are dealing with.
Sure.
These are community issues.
Yeah.
So I think that's, for many, when we talk about, integrating, religion and politics, it's seamless. Because the congregations are meeting the needs, the material and spiritual needs of the people that are attending and in what they're confronting. It leads to, structure. It leads to having a larger structural analysis of why these individuals in the congregations can't pay their rent,
Sure.
or the communities are unsafe, or
Mm-hmm.
the air stinks because you have a landfill near your house, and it's contributing to asthma among kids. Those lead to conversations, like I said, with nonprofits, city council members, perhaps state reps, and on and on.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying is the congregation is addressing the issues within their community, which involves advocacy on different levels and in different ways, which is to shape and adjust public policy, adjust budgeting, which falls under the umbrella of political activity, but it's really just being a citizen of a democratic society and engaging in the democratic process.
True.
So one thing that stands out to me, or a question that I have, is like for pastors and leaders in predominantly white congregations, those who care about racial justice issues, what are some appropriate ways they could lead their congregation to become more civically engaged or politically active in addressing these issues? So addressing racial inequality. So a predominantly white church that sees racial inequality as an issue that they care about, and how could they become more engaged in addressing that issue?
Well, I mean, this is speak to some of your work that you engage in faith-based community organizing, but in many cities around the country, you have coalitions of religious congregations that are addressing metropolitan issues. And these are organizations that have been around for 20, 30, 40 years. So it's responding, in many cases, it's simply responding to the call when asked to participate. So for example, in Detroit, there's an organization called Moses. And the acronym is Metropolitan Organizing Strategies Enabling Strength. I remembered it. And it's a faith-based community organizing firm located in the city of Detroit, but their membership extends outside of the city as well. So you have a number of congregations. Most of the congregations are African American and Hispanic congregations within the city, but about 15% of the congregations are congregations within suburban Detroit, which are predominantly white communities and predominantly white congregations. And the way that Moses recruits congregations is by word of mouth, as well as asking religious leaders if they would allow representatives from Moses to speak with them, to invite them to the organization. So they've had some success, but it hasn't been easy for them. I'll say that. So I think in some cases it's responding to the call when asked. In Washtenaw County, there's a similar organization. It's an interfaith organization committed to immigrant rights, and it's the same issue. They do a lot of great work. There's a lot of congregations affiliated within the organization, but if you look at Washtenaw County, Ann Arbor is within Washtenaw County, maybe less than 1% of congregations are connected to it. And it's responding to the call when they
Sure.
ask.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of it. And it's tough because the narrative from Moses, which is an organization that's concerned about race, immigration, and poverty, is different from the narrative that you hear on TV or talk radio. For example, on issues of racial justice, their argument is that the city of Detroit is in the position that it's in because of decades of unfair, because of public policy that does not, one, provide enough funding for job training, public education, public safety, public health. Public policy does not provide enough opportunities for people in poor communities to live within more affluent communities so they can have access to those resources. That's the argument that they're putting forth, and they're making the case that these are ethical religious issues. Now, outside of Moses, the argument is that they're lazy, you know, and if we support the policies that Moses is pushing us to support or to even think about, our community will look like parts of Detroit. We don't want that. It's a tough sell.
Sure.
Moses has a very tough time convincing people that this is ethical, this is consistent with what you say that you believe.
Sure.
And then if we pursue it, these policies, it will improve the quality of life of everyone within metropolitan Detroit. It's a tough sell, though. It's a tough sell. Right.
Well, no, I mean, I like your response, because I'm thinking, again, a pastor or of a predominantly white congregation might think, okay, hey, how do we address racial inequality? And they might chart out on their own and try and solve the issues, and like they're the first ones in town. But in reality, there's other organizations and congregations out there already doing this work, and in some ways sort of coming in and saying, hey, if you need help, we're available. Or especially if the congregation comes to them and says, can you join this coalition? If we can expand our base, we can, be more effective in bringing about change. And so in some ways, the best response for a predominantly white congregation is to help those who are already doing it and follow their lead. It seems like a great approach and response.
Right. No, exactly. And I think that extends beyond white congregation. It means any congregation that wants to do work to improve the quality of life of people within their community, their state, or even the world. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, there's plenty of organizations that are already doing that work. So yeah, I think that's really applies universally as well. This idea.
Right. Yeah. Well, Professor Brown, this is great, and I really appreciate you talking with us today. And I feel like we've only scratched the surface on this topic. And I want to thank everyone else that joined this spotlight time. And really, if you want to dig deeper into the topic of congregations engaging with social issues, I highly recommend Dr. Brown's book. It's just a great book that's going to be a resource that can really be applicable to any type of congregation. And thank you again, Dr. Brown. And I hope you and everyone else have a great day.
Thank you. Likewise. Take care.